Have you ever found yourself wondering why something that seems so undeniably beneficial, like making sure every child learns to read well, faces such persistent resistance, almost like it's built into the system?
Oh, absolutely. It's a question that baffles so many people, parents, educators. It seems like it should be straightforward.
Exactly. And for the kids who don't learn to read proficiently, the consequences are just devastating. It really casts a long shadow, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It impacts their whole lives.
Right. So today on the deep dive, we're not just asking the question. We're diving deep into a really extensive and honestly quite sobering investigative report.
Wow.
This is part one of a multi-part series from the Unlocking Phonics Project and AI analysis team led by Dennis Humphreys. And the title, it's powerful. The Bureaucratic Wall, How Educational Bureaucracies Systematically Block Reading Reform.
Wow, okay, that's quite a title.
It is. And our mission today really is to unpack what this report found, to lay out how it describes these different educational bureaucracies, federal, state, local, systematically resisting evidence-based reading instruction. And we're talking for decades here.
For over 5 decades, according to the report. That's a long time.
A very long time. And it's important to say up front, like the report does, this isn't about pointing fingers at individuals necessarily. It's about understanding a complex system.
A system they describe as, and this is a direct quote, an institutional conspiracy against American children's literacy.
That's a really strong phrase. Institutional conspiracy. What do they mean by that exactly? It sounds deliberate.
Well, I think the report frames it less like a secret meeting in a dark room and more like the predictable outcome of a system with deeply entrenched interests, inertia, and specific structures. The result looks like a coordinated effort, even if it's not centrally planned, you know.
Okay, I see. So let's start pulling back that curtain. The executive summary you mentioned, it doesn't mince words.
Not at all. It jumps right in.
It says, this investigation uncovered a vast network operating across federal, state, and local levels. And this network, it argues, has systematically pushed back against adopting evidence-based reading methods for, well, over 50 years.
Yeah, and it points to what's driving this resistance. Things like bureaucratic self-interest protecting jobs and influence, financial ties, especially with textbook publishers, and political calculations.
What's really striking, as the report highlights, is that this isn't just like isolated pockets of resistance.
No.
It's framed as a coordinated pushback against the science of reading, you know, the actual research on how kids learn to read best.
Right. And this resistance, they say, stretches from the very top, the U.S. Department of Education, all the way down to school principals. It involves unions, university schools, publishers. It's a whole interconnected web.
So it's much bigger than just arguing about which reading program is best. It's about the whole ecosystem surrounding education.
That's exactly how the report presents it. A systemic issue where all these different parts, maybe knowingly, maybe unknowingly, kind of work together to keep things as they are, to maintain that wall.
Okay, so where does this wall actually begin? The report points right to the top, doesn't it? The Department of Education.
It does. It suggests there's significant evidence of, well, systematic resistance within the department itself when it comes to really pushing for phonics-based federal policy.
They call it institutional inertia at the top.
Exactly. And if you think about the bigger picture, the Department of Education's position, or sometimes its lack of a clear position, sets a huge precedent, right?
Yeah, it signals what's important or what's not.
Precisely. The report suggests that while they're still digging for more comprehensive proof for the full exposé, this initial resistance or inertia at the federal level is like a cornerstone of this bureaucratic wall. It's where the blocking starts to cascade down. A failure of leadership, essentially.
And that cascade effect becomes really clear when you look at the states. The report gives some pretty stark examples here, starting with California. Tony Thurmond, the state superintendent. He's highlighted as a, quote, poster child for this kind of bureaucratic resistance.
Okay, how so?
Well, his public statements back in May 2024 explicitly rejected phonics-heavy approaches. He said things like, "We're not promoting a one-size-fits-all approach in California. Our state is too large and too diverse."
On the surface, that sounds reasonable, maybe. Diversity, flexibility.
Right, but the report argues this is, quote, particularly insidious. It suggests this kind of language uses the positive idea of diversity to actually cloak obstruction, to resist a proven method.
Especially when you look at the results in California. I mean, 37% of fourth graders reading below basic level. That's stark.
It really is. It makes you question the motive behind that rhetoric, doesn't it? Kareem Weaver from the Oakland NAACP's Education Committee put it bluntly. He said, they didn't get to the root cause. We're not explicitly teaching them how to read and crack the code. So the report is essentially asking, is rejecting one-size-fits-all genuinely about diversity? Or is it a convenient way to avoid implementing evidence-based methods that might shake up the system?
That's the core question it raises, yeah. It suggests the latter.
Okay, let's shift over to Ohio. Here, the report highlights a different dynamic, but one that's just as powerful. Coordination between state bureaucrats and teacher unions.
Mm-hmm. This was when Governor DeWine proposed a big chunk of money, $168 million, for science of reading implementation. And he wanted to ban 3Qing.
Right, that method where kids guess words instead of sounding them out.
Exactly, and the pushback was immediate.
What did they say?
Well, the report quotes union leaders. Scott DeMauro from the Ohio Education Association called it dangerous and micromanaging. Melissa Cropper from the Ohio Federation of Teachers said banning teaching types was a slap in the face to educators.
Wow, strong language.
Very strong. And the report calls this coordinated messaging, framing these evidence-based requirements as attacks on professionalism. But what's critical, the report notes, is that this framing totally ignores the harm to children from using ineffective methods.
So it becomes about protecting the adults in the system, not about the kids' reading skills.
That's the pattern the report identifies. Protecting the existing system, protecting adult roles over student outcomes.
And we see something similar in Massachusetts too, right? Both the Teachers Association and the Superintendents Association opposed literacy reform there.
Yeah, and the report points out that the superintendent's opposition is especially revealing. It shows how, quote, mid-level bureaucrats protect the system that employs them, regardless of student outcomes. It's about job security within the bureaucracy.
This wall, then, it's not just federal and state. It goes right down to local school districts, even when they're basically ordered to change.
Right. The Berkeley Unified School District is presented as a textbook example.
What happened there?
Well, despite a federal lawsuit in 2017 and a settlement in 2021, because of their poor reading results, the district just kept using its discredited Lucy Calkins curriculum. You know, the balanced literacy approach.
Even after a lawsuit.
Even after. The court-appointed monitor, George Ellis, documented it. He said basically, without a solid core curriculum, all the interventions are just plug-in holes. They'll never catch up.
The report calls that a bureaucratic strategy, doesn't it? Implementing peripheral changes while protecting the core failure.
Exactly. And a former teacher there, Maggie Riddle, she just put it plainly. Berkeley was anti-phonics. 100%. It was ideological.
That suggests a deep-seated resistance, not just inertia.
It really does. And Berkeley isn't alone. Look at New York City. They initially mandated science-based reading curricula, which sounds good.
Yeah, a step forward.
But then, under pressure from bureaucrats and unions, they loosened the requirements, gave districts more discretion to tweak curriculum.
Ah, the old tweak. Sounds like a loophole.
That's exactly what the report calls compliance theater. You look like you're complying, you make the right noises, but you leave escape hatches, so things don't really have to change fundamentally. Optics over outcomes.
So let's follow the money here. Who actually benefits from this wall staying up? The report really shines a spotlight on the financial side, particularly education publishing companies.
Oh, yeah. It gets into the lobbying. Over $6 million spent just in the last decade lobbying federal agencies. Pearson Education is named as a leader. And in 2023 alone, 440 different clients lobbied the Department of Ed.
440 clients, that's a lot of influence.
It is, and this connection is key. The report states flat out, contracts worth hundreds of millions flow to companies promoting discredited methods. It directly links the money, the profit from selling certain materials, to the resistance against evidence-based practices.
It's not just abstract ideas, then. It's big business.
It's a massive business model built around the current, often ineffective approaches.
And this is reinforced by what the report calls the revolving door system.
Right, that's the movement of people back and forth between government agencies, universities, and these big publishers.
So, like, someone from the Department of Education leaves and gets a high-paying job at a publisher.
Exactly. Or university professors consult for the publishers whose books they recommend. Or state education officials move to curriculum companies. It creates these intertwined interests.
The report mentions Linda Darling-Hammond as an example.
Yes. Hugely influential figure, led Biden's education transition team, chairs of the California State Board of Ed. But the report cites her for promoting reading recovery, despite evidence showing it's often ineffective and very expensive.
So her influence helps keep a questionable program going.
Her advocacy, given her position, according to the report, exemplifies how these connections can help perpetuate methods that the science doesn't support.
So, for you listening, what this means is that the people shaping policy, the people deciding what gets taught, are often tangled up financially with the very companies and systems the report is critiquing. It's complicated.
Very complicated. A web of influence and money.
Okay, let's go even deeper. University education schools. The report calls them perhaps the most entrenched bureaucratic resistance. Why?
Well, the argument is that these institutions have literally built departments, careers, entire programs around specific theories of reading theories that the report says have largely been discredited by scientific research.
And so they defend them.
Fiercely. They have to, in a way. Their strategies, according to the report, include things like hiding behind academic freedom to keep teaching debunked methods, claiming reading is just too complex for one approach, so we need all these other often unproven strategies, actively attacking systematic phonics, calling it reductive, and maintaining partnerships with publishers of the materials they favor.
So the places training our teachers are potentially part of the problem.
That's the core argument, that they're perpetuating a cycle of ineffective practice, reinforcing that bureaucratic wall. It becomes a systemic issue right from the start of a teacher's career.
And again, it's not just ideology. There are financial incentives, too.
Oh, absolutely. Big ones. Ed schools make money from graduate programs in reading, from professional development contracts with districts, from consulting gigs, from research grants, often grants to study the very interventions the report calls failures.
Wow. The report actually quotes an anonymous education dean.
Yes, and it's incredibly revealing. This dean basically said, if we admitted that systematic phonics works for most children, we'd need to restructure our entire reading education program. That would eliminate faculty positions and reduce enrollment.
That's stunning. Just laid bare like that.
It really is. It puts the institutional self-preservation motive right out there.
So it really forces you to ask, is the system prioritizing its own survival, its own finances, over what actually works best for kids? That quote certainly makes you think.
It strongly implies that, yes.
Now, the report argues this isn't just a bunch of separate groups doing their own thing. It calls it a coordinated resistance network, and they use shared messaging.
Yes. This is fascinating, how similar phrases pop up everywhere. At the federal level, you hear talk of local control, teacher autonomy.
Okay.
At the state level, it's often about diversity, flexibility. Locally, it's professional judgment, individual student needs. And universities talk about academic freedom, research complexity.
These all sound quite reasonable on their own.
They do. But the report's point is that when used systematically, consistently, across all these levels, they become a kind of code, a strategy to push back against evidence-based requirements without having to directly challenge the evidence itself. It's quite clever, in a way.
A clever way to maintain the status quo.
Exactly.
And feeding into this, there's something called the professional development industrial complex. Sounds ominous.
It refers to the huge industry, billions of dollars built around training teachers, often in the very methods the report claims are ineffective.
Like the Lucy Calkins programs.
Right, trained over 40,000 teachers. Or Fountas and Pinnell workshops, making millions every year. Reading recovery certifications, creating specialist roles. University partnerships, offering ongoing training.
So basically, a massive industry has sprung up that depends on continuing to train teachers in methods that the science says don't work well.
That's the report's assertion. The financial incentive to keep that machine running is just enormous. It makes real change incredibly difficult.
And beyond the money and the institutions, there's also a political dimension to this resistance.
Yes. The report touches on how reading reform efforts often get framed politically, characterized as conservative attacks or standardization or corporate reform, sometimes even racist policies.
So ideology gets weaponized.
It seems so. This allows bureaucrats, the report argues, to resist change by claiming they're fighting political interference. It shifts the whole debate away from, does this work for kids, to whose side are you on?
And the Department of Education, according to the report, has kind of enabled this.
Yeah, by, for example, not tying federal funding strictly to evidence-based instruction, by keeping programs like reading recovery on recommended lists, by issuing vague guidance that allows wiggle room, and generally by avoiding a direct fight with the established education players.
Let's try and grasp the sheer scale of this. The report puts numbers on this bureaucratic wall. How many people are affected?
It's staggering, really. They estimate it affects 50 million K-12 students every year.
Wow.
3.2 million teachers receiving ineffective training. Over 13,000 school districts buying materials the report deems failures. And 1,200 plus education schools perpetuating the problem.
And the cost. The financial scale.
Mind-boggling. Over $50 billion spent annually just on reading-related stuff. That's $4.8 billion on reading materials, over $15 billion on professional development.
$15 billion on PD.
Yeah, and then billions more on remedial services later on, services needed precisely because the initial instruction failed. It just highlights the massive financial momentum behind keeping the current system exactly as it is.
So, bringing this all together.
Yeah.
What are the main pillars holding up this bureaucratic wall, according to the report?
Okay, the conclusions really tie it together. They point to, one, that coordinated messaging we talked about, framing reform as an attack on teachers.
Right.
Two, the financial incentives that actually reward failure, not success. Three, the ideological defense of debunked theories under the banner of academic freedom. Four, the political framing that dismisses science as just partisan politics. And five, simple institutional inertia protecting jobs and systems built on methods that don't work.
It paints a pretty damning picture.
It really does.
Yeah.
The report makes it crystal clear. They believe this bureaucratic wall isn't an accident. It's systematic, it's coordinated, and crucially, it's profitable for the people and institutions maintaining it.
And that quote you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. America's reading crisis is not the result of insufficient knowledge or resources, but of bureaucratic systems designed to resist the very reforms that would help children learn to read. It's a direct accusation against the system itself.
And the report ends with a call to action.
A very strong one. The time for reform is over. The time for revolution is now.
Revolution! That's quite a statement.
It definitely signals the level of frustration and the perceived scale of the problem.
So this deep dive into part one, it really has illuminated how deep this resistance seems to run. This idea of a systematic, organized blockage against evidence-based reading instruction. It's quite a network they describe.
It really is. It presents a stark picture, suggesting that what often looks like a simple debate over teaching methods is actually, according to this report, a much more complex interplay of systems, money, and entrenched interests, all potentially working against kids' literacy.
And the report's suggestion for breaking it down: dismantling the financial and career incentives that make reading failure profitable.
Mm-hmm.
That leaves us with a really provocative thought, doesn't it? If the systems designed to educate our children might be in some ways financially incentivized to stick with failing approaches, well, what does that tell us about other big societal problems?
Yeah. Right. Could similar dynamics be at play elsewhere, where entrenched systems and perverse incentives block progress on other critical issues?
It's definitely something to think about long after we finish talking today. A really challenging idea to grapple with.